Jimmy Kimmel's a loser. Look, we would do Jimmy Kimmel. I'd do Jimmy Kimmel. I did him a lot.
Maybe confusing me with Stormy Daniels. I don't know. 3 times. We've been on almost 22 years. You were on 3 times. Not a lot. Mike, the situation from Jersey Shore was on this show more times than you, but go on.
There's probably no late-night host who gets under Donald Trump's skin more than Jimmy Kimmel. In part 2 of my sit-down interview with the comedian, he talked about that and what he would do if Donald Trump wins another term.
I'm an optimistic person. I'm not hysterical. I laugh when people say, oh, you've got Trump derangement syndrome.
Yeah.
If you're a reasonable person, you should have Trump derangement syndrome. Right. And by the way, I think he has derangement syndrome about us, too. The fact of the matter is, this is a dangerous person. This is a stupid person. And that's a bad combination. And I think what we're forgetting, I keep forgetting it, and I have to keep reminding myself, is he's not just running for president. He's running to stay out of prison. And that's a pretty powerful thing. He is literally running for his freedom.
But it seems like everybody sort of manned, for good reason, the sort of the battle stations. Whether you're talking about democracy, you can even look over the past week where Donald Trump's talking about arresting his political opponents.
Yeah.
He tried to pressure Disney because of your jokes.
He believes CBS should have their license revoked.
Because he doesn't like how they edited a 60 Minutes package. How concerned are you about what you do right now may have to change if Donald Trump is reelected?
Well, it won't change. I'm concerned, certainly. I think that it would be so un-American if he were to come after people who are speaking out against him.
What do you think, though, is happening in the country where you have 2 weeks out, and it's one thing to just look at Donald Trump and look at some, senators, but we're actually talking about 70, 75, 80 million people.
Yeah. I think we're focused on the wrong things. I think we're being focused on the wrong things. I think that there are certain news networks, if you want to call them that, who are lying to people. I think that there's a certain generation of which we are a part who are used to watching television and seeing the white man in a suit telling us what's going on in the world and believing that what he's saying is true. Mm-hmm. I think that is ingrained in us as Americans. We grew up with Dan Rather and Tom Brokaw and Peter Jennings, and we did not question that what they were telling us was factual. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people now are looking at Sean Hannity and whomever else, and they are not questioning whether or not what they're saying is factual. And what they're hearing is untrue. And I can understand why they think what they think, because they're being told there's a caravan of migrants coming, and then nobody's following up at the end and saying, oh, there was no caravan of migrants coming. And Aurora, Colorado has not been taken over by Venezuelan street gangs. And by the way, this story about cats and dogs being devoured by Haitian immigrants.
In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats. They're eating the pets.
Is preposterous. I will tell you, I've been dreaming the last 3 nights. I've been just going through all this craziness over and over again. It's really starting to take a toll. Like I can't get it out of my head.
Do you look forward to the day?
Oh,
when you don't have to, because one of the things that is so exhausting to me, and why there have been several times where I was like, I don't think I can do this anymore. Mm-hmm. You don't want to talk about, I don't care who it is, the same person every day. And yet, every day, there are more outrageous things said. So if you don't talk about it, it's like you're giving permission structure. So do you look forward to the day when?
Oh, boy, do I. Not only do I look forward to the day, I was telling my wife, I don't feel like I'm mentally prepared for the possibility of a loss. I'm not ready for. I have to get there where I'm ready for either scenario, or for no scenario, which might be the case for several days. Who knows? So, and I have to also kind of think through what I might say the next day, Because, you know, I mean, you're going to have to be up the next morning talking about what happened or what didn't happen. And what message do you want to send to people who watch the show? It's, you know, most of my shows aren't important. That one seems a little bit more important than others because I do have a lot of people kind of asking me what I think and going along with what I think. And it's a big responsibility, you know. So I don't even remember what I said the last time he won. I just remember staying up almost all night and trying to process it, and my wife being very, very upset and feeling very alone. Like, I got to figure out what I'm going to say. Nobody can figure this out for me. None of my writers can figure out my take on this. I have to tell them what it is.
Because people want to hear.
Yeah, and it has
you
to be.
think from your heart.
Yeah, it has to be what you really think. Sometimes you don't know what you think.
So why don't we end on a positive note?
Ken, is that possible?
Yeah, I always have people ask me who my favorite interview ever was.
Oh.
And I, of course, have to say Dr. Brzezinski because
for sure.
his daughter. But you don't have to say that.
No. No.
So do you have a favorite interview or a favorite show? Is there something that stands out that all these years later you look back and go, yeah, that one, I was pretty good?
You know, I've genuinely enjoyed interviewing the presidents and the former presidents. I mean, some of the most fun interviews I've ever done were with President Obama, President Bush, actually. I'm so interested in just every little bit of their lives that every question feels relevant. You know, sometimes you have guests and you're like, I don't know, who cares? You know,
I'm going to work through that.
When it comes to the president, everything is important. And the interview I'm most looking forward to is interviewing President Kamala Harris. That would be, I think that's going to be, I'm going to save my favorite interview for the future.
My interview with late night host Jimmy Kimmel. And tomorrow I'm going to be talking to another talk show legend. After appearing on Real Time on HBO last Friday, it was my turn to interview Bill Maher, who, as always, wasn't shy about many topics, including the war in the Middle East.
Most people around the world that have territorial disputes, it doesn't go on forever.
Right.
At a certain point, they come to some accommodation. Not everything is fair, but I mean, you don't see the Mexicans trying to take back Phoenix, although they could. They could make the claim. They did have it at one point.
We'll show you more of that interview tomorrow, and still.
His own top aide, a military veteran and harsh right-wing super conservative, that's a fair description of John Kelly, is yoking Donald Trump to Hitler. This is as serious as it gets. General Kelly, you might remember, is a four-star general. He's dealt with Homeland Security, he's dealt with wars and military matters, and he served as Trump's chief of staff. He has decided to speak out. We've discussed as a nation, as a society, who and speaks out and when and how far they're willing to go. He is concerned that Donald Trump will take his admiration for Hitler and his vows to abuse power and destroy America as a constitutional republic as we know it. That's what he's concerned about. The general has become a whistleblower. This is a big deal. He's concerned that Trump is a, quote, fascist. He's concerned that Trump denigrates military and its service members. He believes Trump will do what he has already vowed to do, the talk of being a dictator, of abusing power, of abusing military powers, of using violence against people in this country, of treating people who disagree with him, politically or otherwise, as an enemy. And what do you do with enemies? I think we know. Kelly is doing this now for a reason, and he's doing it on tape in recorded, serious, long-form interviews with the New York Times, and it is making huge waves in the campaign. I showed you Kamala Harris speaking out about this as a new and serious thing. And so as a newscaster in these important times, I'm going to, as I said, give you the news. The only thing I'll add is that this is serious. It's about the choices we face as a nation. It's not about whether people say Trump gets away with things or how new is this compared to what people already thought about him. It's brand new. It involves Hitler. And we begin, in Kelly's own words, with the kind of rebuke that has obviously rung alarm bells, even for people who might agree with Donald Trump on certain things.
He commented more than once that, you know, that Hitler did some good things too. And of course, if you know history, again, I think he's lacking in that. But if you know what Hitler was all about, it'd be pretty hard to make an argument that he did anything good.
What would he say when you would lay that out to him?
He just, that'd be the end of the conversation usually.
That's John Kelly, four-star general, in the room one-on-one with then President Trump. And he's not alone. The Atlantic has a big report that Trump said what he wanted was total loyalty, personal, not to the Constitution, but personal loyalty to him from his generals. Quote, Trump reportedly saying, I need the kind of generals that Hitler had. People who were totally loyal to him, that follow orders. Two sources to the Atlantic. Vice President Harris making a break from the planned rallies, and some of them more upbeat, as we've shown you, to deal with this. Again, she's a sitting vice president. This guy's running for president against her. She took a break from those sort of scheduled, more upbeat rallies and GOTV events to mark this moment right now, to denounce Donald Trump.
Donald Trump's former chief of staff, John Kelly, a retired four-star general, confirmed that while Donald Trump was president, he said he wanted generals like Adolf Hitler had. Donald Trump said that because he does not want a military that is loyal to the United States Constitution. He wants a military that is loyal to him. He wants a military who will be loyal to him personally. In just the past week, Donald Trump has repeatedly called his fellow Americans the enemy from within, and even said that he would use the United States military to go after American citizens. And let's be clear about who he considers to be the enemy from within. Anyone who refuses to bend a knee or dares to criticize him would qualify.
Strong statement from the vice president. This came up in the New York Times interview, where when asked whether Trump is basically a fascist, as others have warned, including General Milley, Kelly referred to the definition.
Do you think he's a fascist?
Well, I'm looking at the definition of fascism. It's a far-right, authoritarian, ultranationalist political ideology and movement characterized by a dictatorial leader, centralized autocracy, militarism, forcible suppression of opposition, belief in a natural social hierarchy. So certainly, in my experience, those are the kind of things that he thinks would work better in terms of running America. But certainly, the former president is in the far right area. He's certainly an authoritarian, admires people who are dictators. He has said that. So he certainly falls into the general definition of fascist, for sure.
That's John Kelly on the record, meaning this is him saying these things to the New York Times on tape. We know it's him. That carries a lot of weight. In journalism, it's different than what they call a blind quote. The other article making waves this week had two unnamed sources for the other Hitler material. Now, if you want to speculate, you could say maybe they're two different people. Maybe one of them includes Kelly, who's told a similar anecdote. But these are sources piling up. We are also clearly want to report that Donald Trump's team is denying this. They're saying he did not praise Hitler. They're saying he doesn't subscribe to fascism. He also could come out and speak to this. He could say he's horrified by these comments. He could say what really most politicians in America, in either party, would have ever done. He's not exactly acting like that. So I have to report the denial while also say that he's not exactly going out and saying this is somehow the worst thing ever, in his view, in public. I mentioned General Mark Milley, four-star, who rose to the level of chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And he had said to Bob Woodward, we reported on this at the time, no one's ever been as dangerous to the country as Trump. I realize now he's a total fascist. He's the most dangerous person to the country. In addition to Trump's sort of on-record sort of, oh, hey, we deny it, you have other things he said recently that overlap with this. He has not specifically praised Hitler in public. Maybe he knows that's not a good October closing message. But he's openly said he wants to be a dictator for day one. He's talked about using violence illegally. and on the home front and against Americans. And he's vowed a type of illegal political retribution that would create the kind of constitutional crises where the president asks for something unlawful, and then you have to see who at DOJ, FBI, or in the military is willing to find ways to stand up, stop, blow the whistle, or who sort of goes along with it to some degree. You can go back to 2022, early in the preparations for this campaign, when NPR counted up that Trump had actually made over 100 threats to investigate, prosecute, imprison, or otherwise punish and attack his enemies. And if you want to analyze that, you can explain that in a couple of ways. Number one, he's saying what he wants to do. In journalism and telling stories, that's one of the main ways we understand something. If someone says, I promise to raise taxes or lower them, I promise to attack my political enemies through the government, or I promise not to do that, sometimes it is what it is, and that's one way to understand it. The second is with the endless rigging of the democracy and government system itself. It's something we've reported on here extensively. I've shown you the way the coup plot worked. Rachel Maddow and others have done great and extensive reporting on this very issue, and it's designed to do something even before he gets into office, to scare, intimidate, to silence critics. And there are some people, particularly, say, in journalism or in the watchdog agency of a government entity, that are very familiar with those efforts, and if the system works, they're supposed to keep going and not be cowed. But there's a heck of a lot of other people, say a random volunteer elections worker, or someone just doing a job at a business, who are going to look at that, and if they are not committed to avoiding that kind of risk or threat, or they haven't thought it all the way through, or they're just scared, it may work on them. So that's number two, the rigging, the use of all this to affect things. And then there's number three, the signaling. Separate from what Donald Trump will do himself, it's a signaling to his party and anyone doing business with him in any way, politically or otherwise, this is what we're going to do. John Kelly, in these interviews, also says Trump just preferred a, quote, dictator approach, saying he never accepted the fact that he was not the most powerful man in the world. And by power, I mean an ability to do anything he wanted, anytime he wanted. That matters because Kelly is describing Trump 1.0 with guardrails and an election that he lost. He famously and infamously and potentially criminally tried to overthrow that election, but that was the guardrail. He attacked the peaceful transfer of power and lost again. He lost the election, he lost the coup effort, and was shown the door. Kelly, who knows better than almost anyone what Trump was like behind closed doors, the orders he issued, the things he wanted to get done, is warning it will be worse next time. So I'm reporting to you what Kelly is saying, and you can decide, and the country can decide, how to weigh that in their decision in this election. Here was Kelly as well on the Constitution.
He's certainly the only president that has all but rejected what America is all about and what makes America America in terms of our Constitution, in terms of our values.
Did the former president appreciate the Constitution? Did he appreciate any of these things?
No. An awful lot of people break the law and expect subordinates to break the law or to circumvent the law somehow. And that's where he was coming from.
When he was confronted with the fact that he couldn't do something legally, did he want to do it anyway?
He would try to make the case that he did have the authority.
It's really damning. We use these words, whistleblower, warning, alert. This is that. It is new from John Kelly. It is not old news. It is worse than many of the things we've heard about Donald Trump, including the direct positive reference to Adolf Hitler. It is not more of the same. One sign that it may matter is how a lot of Trump allies are furiously trying to distract from or lie about this today. We're going to deal with the facts of it, and people can weigh it against the other things they're considering as they make their decisions in these final 13 days. And for this potentially important conversation, we are joined by someone who, like John Kelly, has risked his life and served the country and knows something about the military and its obligation not to any one person, even the president, but to the rule of law and the Constitution of this nation.
I want to bring in Paul Rieckhoff, the founder and CEO of Independent Veterans of America and host of the Independent Americans podcast. And Paul, first of all, thank you for being here. And I want to play some more about what John Kelly says. In this case, it's about Donald Trump's feelings as he knows them toward veterans. Take a listen.
Does he have disdain for the disabled?
Well, certainly his not wanting to be seen with amputees that lost their limbs in defense of this country, fighting for every American, to him included, to protect them, that didn't want to be seen with them. That's an interesting perspective for the commander-in-chief to have.
Why didn't he want to be seen with them?
He would just say, look, it doesn't look good for me.
And to repeat what Peter pointed out, this is a 4-star general who is saying this. There are voters, and we know this because we've talked to them, who just see this as more of the same, or maybe he doesn't really mean it, right? What do you hear when you hear that?
I hear a 4-star general who lost his son to a landmine in Afghanistan. His son died in service of this country. So when he thinks about making a decision to go public and have his voice in the record so the whole world can hear, I think it may be John Kelly, the father, stepping out of the role as 4-star general and making sure that the country understands how high the stakes are. And we can't ever normalize any of this because the world is watching and our enemies are watching. When they see a headline like Trump praises Hitler, Trump attacks wounded veterans, Trump fights with Arlington Cemetery, our enemies are celebrating. This is a good news day for Vladimir Putin, who wants to see our country ripped apart, who wants to see the former commander-in-chief attack people in his own country. This is a field day for our enemies. And I think we have to remember that beyond the politics, there is a very important national security environment, and the entire world and all our allies are watching this chaos, and we should never normalize it because this is not normal. And we're talking about not just a president, but potentially electing a commander-in-chief who will be the authority over our entire military and the sons and daughters of people who are watching. If you've got a son or daughter that's in uniform, that's going to be their boss if he's elected.
A commander-in-chief at a time of war, right? We have wars in the Middle East. We have a war in Ukraine. The Atlantic Council International Affairs Group cautions that the U.S. will indeed be electing a wartime president. And in reality, they say this is not a prediction. It is where we are. Does that change the stakes?
Yes. Absolutely. I mean, we're talking about adversaries with nukes. We're talking about multiple regions around the world with conflict. Just today, the Pentagon released information about American troops that were wounded in Iraq because they're fighting ISIS there. We're engaged around the world, in Yemen, in Syria. We've got troops in harm's way right now. It's often below the radar, but American men and women are in uniform and dying, and they need a commander-in-chief who respects them, respects their diversity, who honors them, who appreciates their sacrifice, and, like, take a step back, too. This is not just General Kelly. It is basically every senior military and foreign policy official who ever served under Donald Trump. It's people like McChrystal. It's people like Dick Cheney, the former Secretary of Defense. He wasn't just a vice president. He was the Secretary of Defense who have now aligned against Trump. And they're all ringing the alarm. They're all saying the same thing. This is about our national security and the future of our country, and everyone should be concerned.
So, Yvonne, the Trump campaign, and we read their statement pushing back against these reports, calling John Kelly a liar. But have we heard anything from Donald Trump himself?
At this point in time, I think it's important to be clear here, Chris, is that Donald Trump is not running away from his denigration of his former chief of staff, John Kelly, or the likes of James Mattis, his former Pentagon secretary, or Mark Milley, the former chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Donald Trump instead is using his cavalier attacks against his perceived political enemies, from Liz Cheney to Barack Obama to Liz Cheney and Joe Biden, to his attacks on these military leaders who served in his administration, to calling for the major news organizations, CBS, ABC, NBC, to have their licenses taken away from their ability to broadcast on television. This was all last night in the aftermath of this conversation that John Kelly had with Michael Schmidt at the New York Times. And I think it's important to note, because Donald Trump is not trying to present himself as a uniter for the United States. Instead, he is using this and his own unique authoritative leadership, right? And talking about how he would solve immigration, he says you don't need a bill, you need a president. He has suggested that America needs a dictator for a day. Donald Trump is not necessarily running away from the characterizations that are being described by the likes of John Kelly about him. Instead, he is going on the attack against leaders like him and James Mattis and Mark Milley to suggest that it's because of them that the United States finds itself in, his words, a weak position. Take a listen to him in front of thousands last night in North Carolina at a rally.
I think what happened was when Putin saw how weak we were, how pathetic we were, with the stupid Milley and these generals that aren't even generals as far as I was concerned. What a stupid group of people they were. Mattis, Milley, you know, the real ones, the ones that I used to defeat ISIS. We defeated ISIS. They were the real generals.
Donald Trump, Chris, is campaigning against these generals. I want to make that very clear. This was last night at his campaign rally in North Carolina with now less than 2 weeks left. He's going to be making his way to Georgia. And again, Donald Trump is saying all of this publicly. It's not a political candidate who we have been used to seeing over the last century in the United States of America. Yet he is speaking the words about how he would even like to see the military be used. Just the other day, he suggested that come Election Day, that the military and the National Guard should be ready to come to action if the political left, his enemies, try to rig the election again. It's not clear what he means by that, if he's suggesting the military leaders should disobey the Biden administration's orders and act rogue or independent of the administration. But these are words of Donald Trump here in real time, 2 weeks out from Election Day.
Amy, then there is the story of a 20-year-old Army private, daughter of Mexican immigrants, killed at Fort Hood in 2020. Trump said publicly he would help pay for her funeral. And then later that year, he asked about the cost. The Atlantic reports that according to attendees and to contemporaneous notes of the meeting taken by a participant, an aide answered, yes, we received a bill. The funeral cost $60,000. Trump became angry. It doesn't cost $60,000 to bury an effing Mexican. He turned to his chief of staff, Mark Meadows, and issued an order. Don't pay it. Later that day, he was still agitated. Can you believe it, he said, according to a witness. Effing people trying to rip me off. I want to note again, a Trump spokesperson says that's a lie. Trump never said any of that. But there are other examples of Trump dehumanizing certain segments of the population. So when you hear that reporting by The Atlantic, what do you hear?
Look, the dehumanizing language targeting Mexicans, immigrants, we've heard from him and from, frankly, a number of other right-wing public figures over and over again in recent years. It has become wholly normalized in our political rhetoric, and it goes hand in hand with the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, the white supremacist and racist conspiracy theories we've been talking about. And ultimately, it's intended to sow distrust in our democracy by pitting communities against one another, dehumanizing, finding scapegoats, and ultimately creating division in a way that is intended to undermine our democracy and our institutions. And so we need to understand how it fits into this broader narrative. We talked earlier about the cycle of violence that this sort of rhetoric leads to. As we come up on the anniversary of the Pittsburgh attack, it was an attack that targeted both the Jewish community directly, but was fueled also by an anti-immigrant sentiment, where the shooter specifically used a lot of similar language to what we just heard from former President Trump and other politicians dehumanizing immigrants and believing that Jews were orchestrating the replacement of the white race by bringing them into this country, by replacing our electorate. And so, again, we need to fully understand that none of these things are happening in a silo. The anti-immigrant, anti-Mexican rhetoric that he espoused in this case goes hand in hand with the broader, increasingly normalized bigotry and extremism, and all of it is meant in service of undermining our democracy.
And Paul, I think it's worth noting that we are talking about a young woman who made a choice. You choose now to serve in the military. Nobody is drafting you. She made a choice. She was horribly murdered. And it's reduced to an effing Mexican. Do you think that with the larger community, it used to be the military was sacred if you were a politician, right? Mm-hmm. And maybe even just with people who are part of the military family. it makes a difference when they hear that.
I hope
who
so.
they vote for.
I hope so. It should. Because this is going to be the man who could be in charge of your daughter or your son, setting the tone, setting the example. Vanessa Guillen was more than just a single soldier that was murdered. She sparked a movement. The Vanessa Guillen Act was passed. It was some of the most significant reform around military sexual trauma and sexual assault in history. There was a tremendous movement to find her, to seek justice. So this is a very important symbol for the reform that is overdue, especially in regard to safeguarding women in uniform. So to have Trump hit this story and this person in this way is especially egregious and outrageous and cuts to the core of who he is. This is outrageous, and he has to be in charge of the most diverse military on the planet. How can he do that when he speaks about so many people in this country like that?
Schmidt, how did these interviews come to be?
I think that the major motivating factor for Kelly was Trump's recent comments about using the military domestically. Kelly essentially made a deal with himself when he stopped serving as Trump's chief of staff. And that deal was basically, if Trump said something that was wildly inaccurate, that related to something that Kelly was involved in, then he would speak out and clarify the record. Or if Trump were to say something that was potentially damaging to the country and really troubling, he would also speak out. And I have been trying to get John Kelly to answer these questions in a forum like this for a long time. But when Kelly saw the comments Trump made about using the military against Americans, for Kelly, that was a red line. And I think that John Kelly sees the divide between the military being something that defends the United States abroad and the military not being used on American citizens as something that is rooted in history that goes all the way back to George Washington. I think that Kelly, it's part of his ethos. I think that this was not something that he willingly did. I think that he struggled with the fact that he struggles with the same issue that bothers him about Trump. He struggles with the fact that I'm a retired, uniformed military officer weighing in on something related to a political event. This is someone who hates partisan politics, but I think was so bothered by the comments about using the military domestically that he felt a willingness to say essentially four things. One, I'm not endorsing anyone. I'm not telling you who to vote for, who I'm voting for. I am saying that I think character and fitness is really important, if not more important than policy. And I think you should know what I saw up close, and you should have some flavor of that. And I think obviously a lot has been written about Kelly. Kelly gave a statement to CNN a year ago. A lot was written in The Atlantic about Kelly. A lot's been written in books about Kelly by myself and by colleagues and at the Times and such. The difference here is the audio. And as a reporter doing this, for several years, you start to realize that the written text, while really important and the bedrock of what we do, is only goes so far. And if you're trying to constantly find a new way to tell a story and to demystify the world to people, you have to look for other ways to come up with it. And in this case, it's hearing it from Kelly. There's nothing that Kelly says that is too different than, if you've been following the Trump story, the understanding of the Trump story. But here you have someone who is going on the record, who you can hear in his own voice. And I think that's the difference. I think that's what makes this, different than a text story.
And agreeing to be recorded and share the audio, just explain how that came to be and where you were when you first agreed to be recorded.
Well, I just asked him, I said, can I record this? And he said it was okay to record it. And then I came back to him and I said, look, we've recorded this. I think it's really important that not just people read what you have to say, but that they hear it. Because I think that, Kelly is bothered by the fact that Trump has denied losers and suckers, and that there was an effort in 2020 to push back on the Atlantic story. And Kelly didn't even realize it at the time that the Trump campaign had such a coordinated effort where they got these different people together to say that they never heard this. And it was only a few years ago that Kelly actually figured that out. And it really bothered him that Trump denied it, because I think to Kelly it was an awful thing to say, and in some ways I think it questioned, Kelly's credibility. So I said to him, I said, look, people need to hear it from you. It's a different thing to read something than it is to hear it. And we're going to do a story on this, but we're also going to publish the audio of it.
And he said okay.
He said okay.
And then he does 2 more recorded interviews with you. Let me play some more, because I think the important thing about losers and suckers is, to Kelly, that isn't even the most odious thing he says on the topic. I'll play that.
But he basically said to you that those who died for America on the battlefield were losers and suckers, and he said it more than once.
Yes, but he would say it would always, that something else would get him going. Oftentimes, again, McCain being talked about, and it was like almost a recording. But the point is, anyways, he would say it at times, sometimes unexpectedly, but he never could wrap his arms around why people would serve the country in uniform. What was in it for them? I think he just could never wrap his arms around why people would do things selflessly. What's in it for them? I think that's a much more powerful, but that's just me.
What's the significance of his lack of understanding of the entire concept of public service in Kelly's view?
I think it's that Trump doesn't understand sacrifice, and he doesn't understand a dedication to the country. It's actually rooted in, I think what Kelly would say is that Trump doesn't have an appreciation for the Constitution. He doesn't have an appreciation that if you're in the government or if you're in the military, you have taken an oath to the Constitution, and that you don't serve an individual. And this starts with Trump early on in his presidency talking about my generals. I think that made the generals very uneasy. But it was the idea that the generals were loyal to their oath to the Constitution, and they weren't loyal to Trump. And that the larger idea that there were people who made major sacrifices for this country, that gave up limbs, that gave up their lives in defense of defending the United States, and Kelly says, including defending Donald Trump. And look, the thing that cannot be ignored in all of this is the most tragic part about this, and that is that John Kelly is the most senior American military officer to lose a child on the battlefield in the post-9/11 wars. And so you don't just have Donald Trump saying these things about sacrifice as he's walking through Arlington National Cemetery with Kelly through Section 60, where Kelly's son is buried. He's saying this to Kelly. He's not just a general who was out on the battlefield. This is a general who gave the ultimate sacrifice to the country in his son. And I don't know, I still don't know if I'll ever be able to wrap my head around all of that. And, I don't know.
Paul.
It's gut check time for America. And John Kelly is delivering a gut punch to Donald Trump that will resonate. And I think it's so significant that he's finally come out and spoken for people to hear his voice. This is what we've been waiting for. The only other shoe to drop might be Mattis, right? Mattis hasn't spoken publicly, I don't think, on the record extensively recently. And that would be another body blow to Trump in the final hours that would particularly resonate with independents in key swing states, many of whom are veterans. But I think I keep stepping back and watching how much this must be hurting because they're attacking him so ferociously. I just came from another network where a partisan governor just crapped on John Kelly like he was nobody. They're crapping on the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the former Secretary of Defense, even, Dick Cheney. I mean, they've all lined up in a circle around Trump, and they're saying the same thing. And John Kelly's son, Robert, was killed by a landmine in Afghanistan. And that has got to be what's motivating him in this moment to ring this bell for all Americans. I'm a father of 2 boys. The idea of them joining and losing them overseas is incomprehensible to me. But if that did happen, nothing would stand in the way of me telling the truth and communicating the sacrifice of my son to the American people. And that's what he's doing. And it's hitting hard. And he needs to go further. I think if Kamala Harris wants to deliver a closing argument next week, have him there, have Milley there, have McChrystal there, have Dick Cheney there, have Mark Esper there, have everybody in the defense community that has served with Trump and is now opposed to him, and remind everybody that they're gone, and that if Trump is elected, I talked to Tom Bowman in my podcast tomorrow, the Pentagon reporter for NPR, and he says that there are folks who've told him that they're going to leave the Pentagon. They're going to retire if Trump gets elected. The brain drain we will experience in our military is like nothing we've seen if this guy gets elected, except for the folks who will stay inside to try to do what Kelly and Mattis and others do, which is keep him in check. Imagine a world where Trump didn't have Mattis and Kelly and all these guys around him. That's the world we're going to have if he gets elected.
And with 13 days left until the election, a new voter outreach effort is revving up in the heart of Philadelphia. Joining us now to explain is NBC News correspondent Trymaine Lee. Trymaine, tell us about this new initiative.
Thank you so much for having me. Just days ahead of the voter registration deadline in Pennsylvania, I hit the streets of Philly with more than 100 black men for a very non-traditional voter outreach effort aimed at one of this year's most important voting blocs, other black men. In Philadelphia, they're revved up and ready to go. More than 100 bikers representing some of the city's black motorcycle clubs, cruising through neighborhoods with low voter turnout and low political engagement, especially among black men.
Everybody needs to get out and vote.
The Harley-Davidson riding pastor, Alan Waller, heads the biggest black church in Philly.
Black bikers vote, black men vote, and then just people who care about democracy getting together on a beautiful day. If you don't vote, nobody's going to hear your voice.
Joe Paul is executive director of Black Men Vote.
Okay.
Talk to us about these unique efforts to engage with black men.
You know, black men are not monolithic. We wear tons of different hats. We're interested in barbershops. We're interested in sports. We know brothers are going to pay attention. And it's important for them to see themselves riding through the neighborhood.
VP Kamala Harris and Donald Trump are in a dead heat according to recent national polls. While an overwhelming majority of black voters, including black male voters, support VP Harris, a generational trend is emerging. In a poll of 7 swing states, 21% of black men under the age of 50 lining up behind Trump. That's why both sides are on a battleground state blitz aimed at black men.
Thank you, Pennsylvania.
Harris appearing on black-oriented national media with high-profile interviews with Charlemagne the God, Roland Martin, and The Shade Room, and Trump leaning on his black male supporters, including controversial former NFL standouts Antonio Brown and Le'Veon Bell.
Let's vote for Trump, baby.
Back on the streets of Philadelphia.
We're here to support the vote.
Whether on motorcycles, whether in bikes, cars, walking, we want to make sure that we are representing and making sure that we're moving forward with our constitutional rights.
Black men say they want to be heard.
I think both parties make the mistake of assuming that when you talk to black men about criminal justice reform, you've answered our questions. But we are entrepreneurs, and we are business persons, and we are homeowners, and we are people with student loans because we graduated from college, and we want some real discussions around economic matters in the community.
Black Men Vote set a goal this cycle of registering 100,000 black men in cities all across the country. And they tell me they've hit 95% of that goal, with 60,000 of those registrations coming from black men in Philly.
Trymaine, one of the things I noticed when we did our bus tour through Philly a couple of weeks ago is there seems to be non-traditional people and non-traditional groups that have risen up telling people to vote. And what a lot of the national media misses is there's a strong and large Muslim, Black Muslim, Orthodox Muslim population in Philadelphia.
That's right. This conversation about black men and how engaged black men are in this election cycle has animated and motivated and energized folks on the ground. So, it's kind of a for us, by us kind of mentality going into communities. But as you mentioned, Philly is the only city in this country with a majority black Muslim population. I had an opportunity to talk with legendary Philly rappers Freeway and Beanie Siegel. And Beanie Siegel said that while he's on the fence, Freeway said, I know what I have to do, but we're two Muslim men, and so it's really tough. And so engaging with black men in a city like Philadelphia on matters, issues that matter most to them, not just, women's rights and LGBTQ issues of providing for their families, issues around the war in Gaza, which is, again, obviously hands off given the nature of how things are playing out. But that's the kind of conversation that has to happen in a place like Philly with black men.
And Philly, Caddy, arguably the most important city on the electoral map. And there's been concerns of the National Democrats that the Pennsylvania State Party and in Philadelphia itself, a little bit of a mess with 2 weeks to go.
Yeah, I spent a day in Philadelphia yesterday going around Montgomery County with Madeline Dean, the Democratic Congresswoman there. There was a lot of energy in that area. And what they're trying to do, obviously, is drive up turnout as much as they can to kind of mitigate against the other areas of Pennsylvania where turnout may be lower or perhaps there's less organisation, as you're suggesting. Tremaine, when you're talking to black male voters and you talk about Kamala Harris as a black woman, there's been a tendency historically for black men to vote more Republican than black women. Does the fact that she is a woman of colour make a difference in their vote this time around?
I have not heard that. I think there are a few groups in this country who have benefited more from the leadership of black women than black men. Mm-hmm. People in our communities, whether they're female pastors or business owners or mothers or grandmothers. I think some of the issue is it cuts along generational lines. When you have a younger cohort of black men who aren't necessarily falling in line with the tradition of voting for the Democrat, and there's a contrarian streak among them. There's the manosphere, there's the podcast, there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation. All of these guys, right? But the idea that black men are somehow more misogynistic than other men, there's misogyny that runs through all of us, but that hasn't popped up. Now, again, concern around whether she's tough enough compared to, that kind of false machismo of Donald Trump may play for certain folks, but that's not what I've been hearing.
NBC News correspondent Tremaine Lee, thank you very much for coming on this morning with your reporting. We appreciate it.